Hey guys, tonight we're taking a truly chilling journey to one of the most remote and unforgiving corners of the Viking Age world, the frozen, vast expanse of Greenland. Forget the lush, misleading name given by Eric the Red. You're about to discover what sucked about being a Viking settler in Greenland, a grim reality where a relentless battle against an increasingly hostile environment, profound isolation, and ultimate abandonment led to centuries of unimaginable hardship and, eventually, a haunting, unsolved disappearance. This wasn't a land of easy living, it was a brutal, slow struggle against the very forces of nature. A battle that humanity ultimately lost. Frankly, you probably wouldn't survive the first year in this deceptive green land without longing for the relative warmth and familiarity of your Norse homeland. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me, where in the world are you tuning in from? And what time is it for you right now? Dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself suddenly standing on a rocky, windswept coastline in Greenland. Somewhere around the late 10th or early 11th century CE, the air is crisp, biting, and carries the overwhelming scent of salt, ice, and cold earth. Your newly built longhouse, made of turf and stone, offers meager shelter against the relentless wind. Around you, icebergs shimmer in the distance, and the sea, though beautiful, looks cold and unforgiving. You are a Viking settler, a colonist who has bravely or foolishly followed Eric the Red or his descendants on this ambitious, perilous venture into the North Atlantic. Your new home, despite its enticing name, is anything but green. This is the deceptive green, and the immediate, harsh realities of its environment are about to define your brutally difficult existence. The initial allure of Greenland, famously named by Eric the Red to attract more settlers, was a calculated act of deception, while the southwestern fjords, where the Norse established their eastern settlement and western settlement, did indeed feature some patches of green, arable land suitable for pasture and limited cultivation in the summer months. The overall reality of the island was, and is, one of extreme cold, vast glaciers, and a profoundly challenging environment. Imagine arriving after a perilous sea voyage, filled with hope, only to discover that your green land was mostly barren rock, ice, and a fleeting summer. It truly sucked to be tricked by a Viking marketing scheme. The climate itself was the first and most relentless enemy. Greenland, even its most habitable parts, is fundamentally an Arctic environment. Your settlement would experience long, dark, and incredibly cold winters. Temperatures would plummet far below freezing for months on end, turning the landscape into a frozen wasteland. The ground would be perpetually frozen, with permafrost lying just beneath the thin topsoil, making digging, farming, and construction incredibly difficult. Imagine living for half the year in near total darkness, your days reduced to a few hours of twilight, battling constant sub-zero temperatures that seeped into your bones. It really sucked to live in a perpetual freezer. The short summers, while offering some respite and brief warmth, were deceiving. Even then, the air was often chilly. Influenced by the surrounding ice and cold ocean currents, the growing season was incredibly short. Perhaps only a few months, barely enough time for hardy crops like barley to mature, and certainly insufficient for the kind of robust agriculture that sustained life in Scandinavia or Iceland. This meant your efforts at farming would be constantly challenged by the brevity of the warm season and the lingering chill of the Arctic. The very geography of the settlements, while offering sheltered fjords for farming and harbors, also reinforced their inherent isolation and vulnerability. These narrow strips of arable land were surrounded by immense glaciers and vast, unforgiving wilderness, making internal travel difficult and dangerous, and external contact precarious. You were living on small, habitable islands of rock and grass, surrounded by an immense, frozen, and largely hostile continent. The initial optimism of the settlers, fueled by the sagas and Eric's promises, slowly gave way to the grim realities of this deceptive environment. The resources you relied upon in your Norse homeland, extensive forests for timber, fertile lowlands for abundant grain, and rich fishing grounds were either severely limited or non-existent in Greenland. This meant you had to drastically adapt your way of life, relying heavily on different strategies for survival than your ancestors. One common misconception is that the Norse settlers in Greenland refused to adapt to the Arctic environment, stubbornly clinging to European farming methods, which ultimately led to their demise. While they certainly prioritized traditional farming, especially animal husbandry, like cattle and sheep, as a marker of status, archaeological evidence shows significant adaptation over centuries. They increasingly relied on marine resources. Seals, fish, even whales learned to build with turf and stone instead of wood, and developed specific technologies for the harsh conditions. However, these adaptations, while impressive, were often insufficient against the overwhelming challenges of the Little Ice Age, which we'll discuss later, and their inherent cultural limitations. Historians still meticulously study archaeological findings from Norse farms in Greenland, including animal bone remains, dwelling structures, and tool fragments, to understand the precise mix of traditional practices and adaptive strategies employed by the settlers over centuries. Furthermore, the very climate began to worsen over the centuries of Norse occupation. The medieval warm period, which allowed the initial settlement, began to decline around the 13th century. Ushering in the Little Ice Age, this meant that the already challenging conditions in Greenland became progressively colder, the growing seasons even shorter, and the sea ice more extensive, gradually choking off the vital sea lanes to Europe. You were literally living in a world that was slowly freezing solid, your very environment turning against you with each passing generation. The psychological toll of living in such a relentlessly harsh and deceptive environment would be immense. The constant cold, the perpetual struggle for sustenance, the vast, unforgiving wilderness, and the long, dark winters would erode your spirit. Hope, a fragile commodity, would be constantly tested by the stark realities of nature's indifference. You would be perpetually battling the elements, your very home a constant reminder of the profound challenges to your existence, ensuring that your life was a continuous, brutal endurance test against the cold, hard face of Greenland. The extreme isolation of the settlements also meant that you were utterly reliant on your immediate community for survival. If your crops failed, if your hunting was poor, or if your animals succumbed to the cold, there was no nearby market to trade for food, no easy way to get help from a distant kingdom. Your survival was a direct function of your own and your neighbor's resilience and resourcefulness, a stark reminder of the limitations imposed by the harsh environment. So, your initiation into the life of a Viking settler in Greenland was a harsh lesson in the deceptive green, the immediate, brutal realities of its environment, the relentless cold, the vast glaciers, the short, unforgiving summers, and the overwhelming isolation transformed your ambitious journey into a profound struggle for survival. This pervasive environmental hostility was the first, and perhaps most foundational. Reason why being a Viking settler in Greenland sucked? Defining your existence as a constant battle against the untamed forces of the Arctic. Having endured the deceptive promise of Greenland and the immediate shock of its harsh environment, your daily existence as a Viking settler in Greenland was defined by a relentless, soul-crushing enemy, the endless cold. Forget temperate seasons and abundant warmth. Your life was a perpetual battle against sub-zero temperatures, pervasive ice, and profound darkness, making your survival profoundly sucked. Imagine the transition from the fleeting, cool summer to the omnipresent grip of winter. The sun, once a comforting presence, would begin to dip lower and lower, its precious daylight hours dwindling rapidly for months. You would live in prolonged darkness, with only a few hours of twilight each day in the northernmost parts of the settlements. The sun would disappear entirely for weeks. This perpetual gloom, coupled with the relentless cold, would cast a psychological shadow over your existence, contributing to a sense of isolation and profound melancholy. It truly sucked to live in constant twilight. The temperatures would plummet far below freezing, often remaining sub-zero for months on end. The biting winds, sweeping unimpeded across the barren landscape, would cut through your rough woolen clothes, chilling you to the bone. Every outdoor chore fetching water from ice-covered streams, tending to livestock. Collecting precious driftwood would become an agonizing test of endurance against the elements. Your breath would fog in the frigid air, and exposed skin would quickly turn numb, risking severe damage. It truly sucked to feel perpetually frozen. Permafrost, perennially frozen ground, was a constant, invisible adversary, even in summer. Just a few inches or feet below the surface, the ground remained permanently frozen. This made basic tasks incredibly arduous: digging, excavating foundations for your turf, longhouse, digging pits for food storage, or burying the dead all required immense effort, often involving thawing the ground layer by layer with fire, only to find the next layer still frozen solid. Your body, already strained by labor, would ache from the constant effort of breaking through the unyielding, frozen earth. Farming, while your settlement might have some arable land, the permafrost limited the depth to which roots could grow and severely restricted the types of crops that could be cultivated. The shallow, easily frozen soil meant harvests were always precarious and meager. Ice was pervasive and relentless. The fjords, your lifeline to the sea and the outside world, would often freeze solid for months, cutting off your access to vital marine resources like seals and fish. This could lead to periods of severe starvation if land-based food sources were depleted. Travel by boat, essential for communication between the eastern and western settlements, and for vital trade with Iceland and Norway, would become impossible. Amplifying your profound isolation, imagine being completely trapped by ice, unable to leave your fjord for half the year. It really sucked to be locked in by nature. The lack of sufficient fuel for heating further compounded your misery. Greenland had very few trees, especially large ones suitable for firewood. You would rely on driftwood namutomag. Namutomag, laboriously collected along the coast, a dangerous task in icy conditions or turf. Peat and animal dung as fuel for your longhouse fires and forges. These low-quality fuels often burned inefficiently, producing significant amounts of smoke and soot, which, in poorly ventilated longhouses, would irritate your eyes and lungs, causing chronic respiratory problems. Despite your best efforts, maintaining adequate warmth in your longhouse would be a constant struggle, leaving parts of your dwelling perpetually cold and damp. The cold led directly to physical ailments. Frostbite your exposed fingers, toes, nose, and ears were constantly at risk of frostbite. Where tissue freezes and dies, this could lead to permanent disfigurement, chronic pain, and the agonizing loss of digits, making fine tasks or strenuous labor impossible. Hypothermia, prolonged exposure to sub-zero temperatures, especially if wet or exhausted, could cause a dangerous drop in core body temperature, leading to confusion, collapse, and often silent death during sleep. Respiratory illnesses, the cold, damp conditions, coupled with smoke inhalation from indoor fires, would lead to rampant colds, bronchitis, and pneumonia, which, in a world without modern medicine, could quickly turn fatal. Your lungs were perpetually battling the elements and the indoor air pollution. The psychological toll of the endless cold and darkness was immense. Living for months in near total gloom, battling constant freezing temperatures, and watching the landscape transform into an unyielding expanse of white and gray would erode your spirit. You would experience profound isolation, melancholy, and a sense of hopelessness. The fight for survival against the cold would consume your every waking thought, leaving little room for joy, leisure, or intellectual pursuits. This pervasive, grinding struggle against the very environment you inhabited made every winter a test of profound mental endurance. One common misconception is that the Norse settlers in Greenland simply froze to death because they clung stubbornly to their European ways. While their initial attempts at traditional farming were challenged, archaeological evidence shows significant adaptation over centuries. However, the onset of the Little Ice Age, a period of global cooling from roughly the 14th to the 19th centuries, was a massive, irreversible climate shift that fundamentally worsened already marginal conditions. This meant that even with adaptations, the environment became increasingly hostile to their traditional farming methods and their lifeline to Europe, ultimately contributing to their demise. Historians still meticulously study ice core samples from Greenland and dendrochronology tree ring analysis from the Norse settlements to reconstruct the precise climate fluctuations and their devastating impact on the settlers' ability to farm, raise livestock, and maintain trade, confirming the relentless and worsening environmental pressures they faced over centuries. Furthermore, the very design of their longhouses, while providing communal warmth from central fires, also contributed to the challenges. The turf walls, while insulating, could be damp, fostering molds. The lack of proper chimneys in some early structures meant smoke leakage. These internal environmental factors, combined with the extreme external cold, created a complex health battle within the very homes meant to protect them. Your Hanok's struggle for warmth, recalling a previous episode, was nothing compared to this. The constant need for resourcefulness was draining. You had to learn to build with turf and stone. As timber was scarce, you had to learn to rely more heavily on marine resources. You had to find new ways to adapt to an environment that was slowly, subtly turning against you. This constant improvisation, this ceaseless battle against natural limitations, made every aspect of your life a demanding and exhausting struggle, leaving no room for ease or comfort. So, your daily life as a Viking settler in Greenland was defined by the relentless, all-consuming misery of the endless cold, the pervasive sub-zero temperatures, the permafrost, the freezing fjords, and the perpetual darkness of winter relentlessly attacked your body and spirit. This unforgiving environmental hostility, ensuring every moment was a struggle for warmth and survival, was a defining, profoundly sucked aspect of being a Viking settler in Greenland, leading to a slow, agonizing battle against the very elements. Even as your body battled the relentless cold and the pervasive permafrost, Your daily survival as a Viking settler in Greenland was defined by your monotonous diet. Forget diverse culinary options or consistently fresh ingredients. Your sustenance was heavily reliant on marine resources, lacking diversity, and constantly threatened by hunger, making your daily food consumption profoundly sucked. Imagine your meals in your turf longhouse. Unlike your ancestors in Scandinavia, who might have a more varied diet of grains, domestic animals, and wild game, your options in Greenland were severely constrained by the harsh environment. The short growing season and poor soil limited your ability to cultivate hardy grains like barley, and even then, harvests were precarious. This meant your diet would be heavily, almost exclusively, reliant on two primary sources: marine animals and, to a lesser extent, your dwindling domestic livestock. It truly sucked to eat the same few things day in and day out for decades. Your absolute staple would be seal meat and blubber. Seals were abundant in the Greenlandic fjords and provided crucial protein and, most importantly, immense amounts of fat. In the frigid Arctic climate, fat was not just a luxury. It was a fundamental necessity for survival, providing the dense calories needed to keep your body warm and fueled. You would hunt seals from kayaks or small boats, a dangerous and cold endeavor, but a vital one. Imagine consuming seal meat, often boiled or dried, and rendering its blubber for cooking, eating, and even fuel for your lamps. While vital, the taste of seal is distinct, often oily and fishy, and eating it day in and day out would quickly lead to profound palate fatigue. It truly sucked to smell like seal all the time. Beyond seals, fish was another critical component. You would fish the cold waters of the fjords for cod, capelin, and other species, often using hooks and lines. Like seals, fish provided essential protein. However, without refrigeration, preserving fish was a challenge. It would typically be dried stockfish or heavily salted. Dried fish was incredibly tough and bland, requiring immense chewing effort or extensive rehydration. Salted fish was, of course, intensely salty, contributing to constant thirst and the monotony of flavor. Imagine chewing on a piece of dried cod that felt like leather, its pervasive, fishy, salty taste dominating every meal. It really sucked to literally have to beat your dinner. Your domestic animals, cattle, sheep, and goats were precious, but their contribution to your daily diet was limited, especially as the climate worsened. They were difficult to keep fed through the long winters, requiring immense amounts of scarce fodder. Therefore, they were primarily kept for their milk, wool, and labor, rather than for regular meat consumption. Slaughtering an animal was a significant event, usually reserved for autumn before winter fodder ran out, or for special feasts. Their meat, when available, would be carefully preserved through drying or salting. Again, not consumed fresh for long. Archaeological evidence from Norse farm middens in Greenland shows a gradual shift over centuries from a higher proportion of domestic animal bones to an increasing reliance on marine mammal bones, indicating their decreasing ability to sustain livestock. Vegetables and grains were incredibly scarce. The short, cool growing season and thin soil limited cultivation to only the hardiest crops like barley. Even these harvests were precarious and not robust enough to form a dietary staple. Fresh vegetables were a rare treat in summer, if your small garden yielded anything. This meant a profound lack of vitamin C, leading to rampant scurvy, fiber, and other essential nutrients found in diverse plant matter. Imagine living without fresh greens, your body constantly craving the freshness it rarely received. It really sucked to be a Viking who couldn't really farm. This extremely monotonous and limited diet had profound nutritional implications. Scurvy, the severe lack of vitamin C from fresh produce, would lead to widespread scurvy. Imagine your gums bleeding, your teeth loosening and falling out, old wounds reopening, and your limbs swelling painfully. This debilitating disease would slowly, agonizingly, break down your body, leading to profound fatigue and eventually a slow, painful death. This was a constant, horrifying threat that many settlers faced, making their lives miserable. Chronic malnutrition, while high in fat from seals and protein from seals and fish. The diet lacked the broader spectrum of vitamins and minerals found in a more varied intake. This contributed to overall physical weakness, compromised immune systems, and made settlers susceptible to a host of other illnesses and infections. Your body was fueled, but not truly nourished. Dental problems, the constant consumption of tough, dried, and often gritty foods like dried meat, stockfish, and coarse barley bread would lead to severe tooth wear, decay, and abscesses, coupled with scurvy. This meant persistent toothaches, infections, and early tooth loss, making chewing itself an agonizing ordeal. Archaeological findings of Norse Greenlanders' skeletal remains often show severe dental issues. The psychological toll of eating such a monotonous and unappetizing diet, day after day, for years, would be immense. Food, a source of comfort and pleasure for most, would become a mere means of survival. The constant repetition of the oily seal meat and tough dried fish, the craving for fresh greens or a taste of home, would erode your spirit, leading to profound palate fatigue and a sense of constant deprivation. Imagine enduring winters where your only food tasted like the ocean, in various stages of preservation. One common misconception is that the Norse settlers in Greenland refused to eat fish and seals due to cultural preferences for beef and dairy, while they certainly valued their traditional livestock as a marker of status. Archaeological evidence from Norse farm middens and bone analysis of human remains in Greenland clearly shows a significant and increasing reliance on marine resources, especially seals, over the centuries, indicating adaptation. However, this adaptation was often out of necessity, not preference. And their traditional livestock cattle. Sheep did remain a part of their diet as long as possible, but their diminishing numbers highlighted the increasing challenge. Historians still meticulously study bone isotope analysis, which tracks dietary sources through chemical signatures in human bones from Norse Greenlanders, revealing a shift over time towards a marine-based diet, confirming their adaptive strategies but also the constraints imposed by the environment. Furthermore, the very act of hunting and processing seals and fish was physically demanding and dangerous. Long, cold hours spent on the water, battling sea ice and unpredictable weather, risking capsizing or drowning, were required to secure your food. The subsequent processing, skinning, butchering, drying, salting was laborious and often done in freezing conditions. This meant that every bite you consumed was earned through immense personal effort and constant risk. Adding another layer of misery to your meal, the uncertainty of the hunt also contributed to the daily stress. Unlike farming, which offered a relatively predictable yield, though still subject to weather, hunting for seals or fishing for large catches was inherently unpredictable. There would be days, even weeks, when the hunt yielded little, leading to acute hunger and desperate anxiety for your family. This constant fluctuation in food supply, dependent on the sea's bounty, added another layer of precariousness to your already difficult existence. So, your daily food as a Viking settler in Greenland was defined by a profound monotony and scarcity. Your diet revolved almost exclusively around seal meat, blubber, and dried fish. Lacking diversity and freshness, this pervasive deprivation, leading to debilitating nutritional deficiencies like scurvy and constant palate fatigue, was a defining, profoundly sucked aspect of being a Viking settler in Greenland, ensuring that your long life in the Arctic was a continuous, grim battle against persistent hunger and culinary despair. Even as your body battled the relentless cold and your spirit withered under the monotony of seal and fish. Your very existence as a Viking settler in Greenland was defined by a profound and crushing reality: isolation. Forget the vibrant trade routes and bustling communities of your Norse homeland. You were utterly cut off, far from home and largely forgotten by the wider world, making your survival profoundly sucked. Imagine your remote settlement, nestled deep within a fjord. Your closest neighbors might be miles away, accessible only by boat in summer or treacherous overland treks in winter. The nearest Norse settlements in Greenland, the western settlement and the eastern settlement, were themselves hundreds of miles apart, making even internal communication challenging. Your world had shrunk to a tiny, isolated outpost, a lonely speck in the vast, unforgiving Arctic. It truly sucked to live at the end of the world. The most profound aspect of this isolation was your severance from your Norse homeland, Norway and Iceland. These were the lands of your ancestors, the source of your culture, your technologies, and your very identity. Your connection to them depended entirely on transatlantic sea voyages, perilous journeys across the North Atlantic's frigid, stormy waters. These voyages were incredibly dangerous, fraught with threats from icebergs, violent storms, and the vast, empty expanse of the ocean. Each trip was a gamble, and as the climate worsened with the onset of the Little Ice Age, which we will discuss in Chapter 7, these voyages became even more perilous and less frequent. Imagine waiting years for a ship, hoping it brought news from home, or vital supplies, knowing it might never arrive. Swallowed by the sea, it really sucked to literally float your hopes on a dangerous ocean. This limited contact meant a profound lack of new supplies and technology. You couldn't simply send for iron tools, building timber, or specialized goods. What you brought with you, or what you could produce locally, which was little, given the scarcity of wood and metal, was all you had. Over generations, your technology might stagnate or even decline as tools wore out and could not be replaced or properly repaired. Imagine trying to maintain a complex farming or hunting community without access to replacement parts or new innovations from the thriving European continent. This forced self-reliance, born of isolation, made every broken tool a crisis and every lost resource a major setback. Your cultural isolation was immense. You were separated from the evolving Norse traditions, the sagas, the news from kings and jarls, and the very intellectual and social currents that define the broader Viking world. While you clung fiercely to your Norse identity, building churches and writing runic inscriptions, your culture would inevitably become more insular, adapting to the harsh realities of your isolated environment. The vibrant intellectual exchange and the social dynamism of your homeland would be a distant memory, replaced by the stark, monotonous rhythms of Arctic survival. The psychological toll of this profound isolation was immense. You would live with perpetual homesickness, a deep yearning for the familiar landscapes, the bustling markets, and the close-knit communities of your ancestral lands. The vast, empty ocean separating you from home would be a constant reminder of your profound separation. Loneliness, despair, and a sense of being utterly forgotten by the wider world would gnaw at your spirit, This chronic sense of detachment, this feeling of being perpetually cut off, was a pervasive and silent misery that affected generations of Greenlandic Vikings. It truly sucked to be forgotten by everyone. Communication was virtually non-existent for long periods. You couldn't send letters or messages easily. News from Europe or even from the other Norse settlement on Greenland could take months or even years to arrive, if at all. This lack of information meant you lived in perpetual uncertainty, unaware of political shifts, new technologies, or even major events affecting your kin. Imagine not knowing if your cousins or former neighbors in Norway were alive, or if the king you once swore fealty to still reigned. This informational void added to your sense of detachment and vulnerability. The vulnerability to external threats was also amplified by your isolation. If your settlement faced an attack from indigenous peoples, which happened, as we'll discuss in Chapter 6, or if a disease swept through your community, there was no nearby army to call upon, no immediate medical aid from outside, no easy way to send for help. You were utterly reliant on your own meager resources and the resilience of your small, isolated community. This profound self-reliance, while fostering a fierce independence, also meant that any crisis could quickly become an existential threat. With no hope of external intervention, one common misconception is that the Norse settlements in Greenland had regular and consistent trade links with Europe throughout their entire existence, while trade with Norway and Iceland was vital, particularly for exporting Greenlandic products like walrus ivory and polar bear skins, and importing essential goods like iron and timber. These links became increasingly tenuous over the centuries, especially with the onset of the Little Ice Age and political shifts in Norway. Ships became less frequent, voyages riskier, and eventually, regular contact ceased entirely, effectively abandoning the settlers. Historians still meticulously study archaeological findings of imported European goods or their absence in later periods, detailed Norse sagas like the saga of Eric the Red and Grenlandinga saga, and later European shipping records to understand the precise patterns and eventual decline of transatlantic contact, confirming the growing isolation of the Greenlandic Norse. Furthermore, the limited genetic pool resulting from prolonged isolation likely contributed to various health issues over centuries, with little influx of new settlers or marriage partners from Europe. The Greenlandic Norse communities likely became increasingly inbred, potentially leading to a higher incidence of genetic disorders or a reduced ability to adapt to new pathogens, further exacerbating their health vulnerabilities and contributing to their eventual decline. This silent biological consequence of isolation was another insidious factor in their long struggle. The psychological toll of this chronic isolation, this profound sense of being cut off from the known world, contributed to a pervasive sense of loneliness and ultimately despair that touched every aspect of your life. Your existence was a perpetual test of endurance, not just against the elements, but against the crushing weight of being forgotten by the very world you came from. The vast, empty ocean, once a path to new lands, became an insurmountable barrier, a terrifying symbol of your permanent solitude. So, your life as a Viking settler in Greenland was profoundly sucked due to profound isolation. Cut off from your Norse homeland by perilous sea voyages, perpetually lacking new supplies and cultural contact, and living in a remote, hostile environment, your existence was defined by a profound sense of loneliness. This pervasive isolation, ensuring your survival was a constant, desperate, self-reliant struggle, was a defining, profoundly miserable aspect of being a Viking settler in Greenland, leading to a slow, agonizing battle against both nature and the chilling silence of abandonment. even as your body battled the relentless cold and your spirit withered under the profound isolation. Your daily existence as a Viking settler in Greenland was a constant. Losing fight against disease and decay, forget a pristine, healthy life, the harsh environment, coupled with pervasive malnutrition and primitive medical care, ensured that illness was rampant, making your very survival profoundly sucked. Imagine the pervasive cold inside your turf longhouse. While your central hearth might offer some warmth, the air remained damp and chilling, particularly in poorly ventilated spaces. This persistent exposure to cold, combined with chronic malnutrition from a monotonous diet, lacking fresh vitamins and diverse nutrients, severely compromised your immune system. Your body's defenses, already weakened by constant physical exertion and insufficient rest, were simply unable to fight off pathogens effectively. You were perpetually vulnerable, a walking target for every ailment. It truly sucked to have your body constantly trying to survive, but always failing. This weakened state made you highly susceptible to a wide array of infectious diseases that thrived in the crowded, often unsanitary conditions of a Viking longhouse during the long, dark winters. Respiratory illnesses. Colds would swiftly escalate into severe bronchitis, pneumonia, or pleurisy. The cold. Damp air, combined with smoke inhalation from indoor fires, which often lacked efficient chimneys, and the close proximity of family members and even livestock as animals were sometimes brought inside for warmth, created ideal conditions for these lung infections. Imagine a hacking cough that racked your chest, your lungs filling with fluid, your breath coming in ragged gasps, knowing there was no effective medicine to offer relief, and witnessing your children suffer the same fate. Gastrointestinal diseases. Despite your best efforts at food preservation, spoilage and contamination were common, as discussed in Chapter 3. You would suffer from frequent bouts of dysentery, the bloody flux, causing severe diarrhea, agonizing stomach cramps, and rapid dehydration. Typhoid fever and other waterborne illnesses contracted from contaminated well water or stagnant sources, especially after ice melt, would also sweep through communities, rapidly debilitating and killing dozens. The constant need for water, often from suspect sources, was a cruel gamble. Vitamin deficiencies. As explored in Chapter 3, the severe lack of vitamin C from fresh produce, which was almost non-existent in winter, led to widespread scurvy. Imagine your gums bleeding, your teeth loosening and falling out, old wounds reopening, and your limbs swelling painfully, all while suffering from profound, debilitating fatigue. This was a slow, agonizing bodily disintegration that made you incredibly vulnerable to every other disease, slowly breaking down your very ability to fight other widespread ailments. You would also contend with various other fevers, skin infections exacerbated by poor hygiene and constant dampness, and parasitic infestations like lice and fleas. As discussed in the context of medieval castles, your body was a living battlefield for unseen microbial enemies. With no reliable way to win the war, the mortality rate in winter was significantly higher than in other seasons, particularly for the most vulnerable members of your family: infants, young children, and the elderly. Their weaker immune systems and lower body fat reserves made them prime targets for the cold and disease. Imagine watching your child succumb to a fever, their tiny body burning, their breath shallow, or your elderly parent waste away from a cough that simply wouldn't go away, knowing there was nothing you could do. These were common, heartbreaking occurrences, leaving profound scars on the surviving family. It truly sucked to bury your own children in frozen ground. Medical knowledge and care were primitive, while Viking society had healers who understood herbal remedies and basic wound care. Effective treatments for severe infectious diseases were non-existent. Healers might prescribe various herbal concoctions, some with limited efficacy, many not, perform rudimentary bone setting, often leading to deformities, or offer spiritual interventions like charms or prayers. However, there were no antibiotics, no understanding of germ theory, no sterile environments for treatment, and no hospitals as we know them if you fell severely ill. Your survival depended entirely on your body's own brute resilience and immense luck. Many resorted to desperate folk remedies, sometimes harmful, in a futile attempt to cling to life. It really sucked to be a patient in the Viking Age. The lack of sanitation in longhouses and settlements exacerbated the spread of disease. Waste disposal was rudimentary, contributing to widespread contamination of living areas and water sources. The cramped living quarters, where multiple generations, and sometimes animals, huddled together for warmth, provided ideal conditions for illnesses to spread rapidly from person to person. A single sick individual could quickly infect an entire household, turning a hanok, or in this case, a longhouse, into a localized epidemic. One common misconception is that the Norse settlers in Greenland, being hardy Vikings, were exceptionally healthy, while they were undoubtedly resilient. Archaeological studies of Norse skeletal remains from Greenland consistently show widespread evidence of chronic infectious diseases, significant nutritional deficiencies, particularly scurvy and anemia, and severe dental problems. These findings directly contradict romanticized notions of perfect health and confirm the brutal impact of their harsh diet and unsanitary living conditions. Historians and bioarchaeologists still meticulously study these osteological records to reconstruct the precise health profiles and impact of disease on the Greenlandic Norse population, consistently revealing a grim picture of pervasive illness. Furthermore, the psychological toll of constantly battling sickness, of watching your loved ones suffer and die from agonizing diseases, and of knowing that your own body was always at risk, would be immense. This pervasive atmosphere of illness and death eroded morale, fostered despair, and made every day a grim countdown to the inevitable. Your existence was a perpetual struggle against unseen enemies, turning your home into a place of constant fear and misery. The sounds of coughing, the smell of sickness, and the sight of emaciated bodies would be a constant, harrowing reality, even if you yourself survived. This grim reality underscored the profound physical misery beneath the surface of Viking life. The environmental factors of Greenland specifically exacerbated disease. The long, dark winters reduced sun exposure, impacting vitamin D synthesis, and the cold contributed to respiratory problems. The sea ice could cut off access to vital marine resources. Worsening malnutrition, the very climate, combined with your lifestyle, compounded your vulnerability, ensuring that disease was a silent, ever-present killer. So, your daily life as a Viking settler in Greenland was profoundly sucked because disease and decay were constant companions. The pervasive cold, the chronic malnutrition from a limited diet, and the unsanitary living conditions made you perpetually vulnerable to rampant respiratory, gastrointestinal, and deficiency diseases that claimed lives at an astonishing rate. This horrifying prevalence of illness and the primitive medical care ensured that your precious longhouse, intended as a sanctuary, was also a perpetually unhealthy and often deadly place to inhabit, making every season a profound and agonizing fight for your very existence. Even as your body struggled against the ravages of disease and your spirits withered under the endless cold, your precarious existence as a Viking settler in Greenland was complicated by the presence of your Inuit neighbors. Forget simple isolation. Your relationship with the indigenous Thule people was a complex, often fraught mix of trade, tension, and competition for territory, making your survival profoundly sucked. Imagine the vast icy landscape of Greenland. You are Norse, relying on a mix of European farming traditions and new Arctic adaptations. But you were not alone on this immense island. The Thule people, ancestors of modern Inuit, were also present. Having migrated from Arctic North America, they were supremely adapted to the Arctic environment, masters of hunting marine mammals, especially seals and whales, and living in ways that differed profoundly from your Norse traditions. Your encounters with them, whether fleeting or prolonged, were a constant source of both vital opportunity and immense danger. It truly sucked to have complex neighbors in the middle of nowhere. The relationship between the Norse settlers and the Thule people was complex and evolved over centuries. It was a mixture of trade. This was perhaps the most crucial interaction, at least initially. The Thule possessed valuable Arctic resources that the Norse desperately needed or that were highly prized in Europe. You might trade with them for narwhal tusks, often mistaken for unicorn horns in Europe, and highly valuable polar bear skins, and perhaps crucial iron or driftwood if your Norse ships failed to bring enough in return. The Thule might desire Norse iron tools, textiles, or other European goods. This exchange, while beneficial, was often sporadic and driven by mutual necessity. Imagine trying to barter for vital iron tools with people whose language and customs were utterly alien to you, knowing your survival might depend on a good deal. It really sucked to trade with strangers for your basic needs. Tension and competition for resources. As the climate worsened with the onset of the Little Ice Age, which we will discuss in Chapter 7, resources became scarcer for everyone. Both Norse and Thule relied heavily on marine mammals for sustenance. Competition for prime hunting grounds, particularly for seals and whales, would inevitably lead to friction. You, the Norse settler, might find traditional hunting areas now being utilized by Thule hunters, creating disputes over territory and access to vital food sources. This competition, born of necessity, could easily escalate into violent confrontations, transforming potential trade partners into fierce rivals. Cultural differences and mistrust. The Norse and Thule had vastly different ways of life, belief systems, and social structures. The Norse clung to their European farming traditions and Christian faith, while the Thule were nomadic hunters, adapted perfectly to the Arctic. This fundamental cultural divide often led to mistrust, misunderstanding, and a lack of deep integration. The Norse sagas and later European accounts often refer to the Thule as Skraelings, a derogatory term for native peoples, reflecting a condescending and often fearful view. Imagine being surrounded by people whose very existence challenged your worldview, and whom you fundamentally mistrusted, even as you traded with them. It truly sucked to be culturally isolated by your own prejudices. Violence and conflict were not uncommon, while direct. Large-scale warfare between the Norse and Thule appears to have been rare given the limited Norse population. Localized skirmishes, raids, and violent encounters certainly occurred, especially over hunting grounds or in retaliation for perceived wrongs. Archaeological evidence sometimes shows signs of violence on Norse skeletons, and Thule settlements have yielded Norse artifacts, some possibly acquired through conflict. Imagine constantly being vigilant for a potential raid from your neighbors, knowing that even seemingly peaceful encounters could turn deadly if resources became too scarce. It really sucked to literally fight for your dinner. The Thule people were also highly mobile, adapting their settlements to the availability of marine resources. This mobility, in contrast to the Norse's more permanent farming settlements, made sustained, predictable interaction, challenging. You would never truly know if a Thule camp would be in a particular area, or if you would encounter a large hunting party, adding another layer of unpredictability to your already precarious existence. One common misconception is that the Norse settlers failed to learn from the Thule people, stubbornly clinging to their European ways, which led to their demise. While the Norse did not adopt all Thule technologies like the highly efficient kayak or the specialized whaling techniques, archaeological evidence indicates they did engage in significant cultural exchange and adaptation, particularly in hunting techniques for seals and in the use of local resources. However, their core identity as European farmers and their reliance on external trade for crucial iron and timber remained, ultimately limiting the extent of their adaptation to the purely Arctic lifestyle of the Thule. The very fact that the Norse traded for walrus ivory, a valuable European export, but did not extensively adopt Inuit whaling technologies, is a complex point of academic debate. Highlighting the selective nature of their adaptation, historians still meticulously study archaeological findings of Norse and Thule artifacts in close proximity, as well as isotope analysis of human remains to understand diet, to decipher the precise nature and extent of their interactions and cultural exchange over centuries, often finding a far more nuanced picture than simple failure to adapt. Furthermore, as the climate worsened with the onset of the Little Ice Age, which we will delve into in Chapter 7, the competition for diminishing resources intensified. The increasing sea ice and colder temperatures made both Norse farming and their European trade links more difficult, pushing them more heavily onto marine resources, bringing them into direct competition with the Thule, whose adaptive hunting technologies were superior for the increasingly harsh conditions. This climate shift turned a cautious coexistence into a zero-sum game for survival. The lack of numerical superiority also made the Norse vulnerable. Their population was relatively small and isolated. The Thule, while perhaps not always numerous in any single area, had a vast geographic presence and could move freely across the Arctic. This meant that any large-scale conflict would likely favor the Thule. Adding to your constant fear and vigilance, the psychological toll of living in close proximity to and constant tension with an alien culture whose survival strategies were often superior to yours would be immense. You would live with a subtle, pervasive fear of confrontation, a constant need to balance trade with vigilance, and the gnawing anxiety that resources might become so scarce that peaceful coexistence was no longer possible. Your isolated existence was rarely truly solitary. It was intertwined with the unpredictable presence of your powerful, yet alien, neighbors. So, your life as a Viking settler in Greenland was profoundly sucked due to your complex and often fraught relationship with your Inuit neighbors. This mix of vital trade for essential resources, simmering tension over diminishing hunting grounds, profound cultural differences, and the constant threat of localized violence ensured that your Arctic existence was a perpetual battle, not just against nature, but against the unpredictable realities of human interaction in a harsh, unforgiving land. Even as your settlement struggled with the demands of the harsh climate and the complexities of its Inuit neighbors, a truly devastating, irreversible force began its slow, relentless assault, the Little Ice Age. Forget fleeting cold snaps. This profound global climate shift slowly choked the life out of your Norse Greenlandic settlement, making your very existence a profoundly sucked and ultimately doomed endeavor. Imagine the subtly chilling changes over the generations. When Eric the Red first settled Greenland in the late 10th century, the climate was experiencing a relatively warmer period known as the medieval warm period. This allowed for enough grazing land for cattle and sheep, and short. Precarious growing seasons for hardy crops like barley in the sheltered fjords. This initial warmth, however relative, was the very foundation of the Norse settlement's feasibility. But then, things started to change, slowly, insidiously, decade by decade, from roughly the late 13th century to the mid-19th century. The Northern Hemisphere experienced a period of significant global cooling known as the Little Ice Age for Greenland, which was already on the very margin of human habitability. This climate shift had catastrophic consequences. You would observe your world gradually, irrevocably growing colder. Shorter, colder summers. The already brief growing season became even shorter and colder. Average summer temperatures dropped, meaning the limited crops you could cultivate, barley, hay for fodder, struggled to mature, leading to more frequent and severe crop failures. This directly impacted your food supply and, crucially, your ability to feed your precious livestock through the long winters. Imagine your barley fields, once a source of hope, now constantly struggling against early frosts and insufficient warmth, yielding less and less with each passing year. It truly sucked to watch your farm slowly freeze to death. Longer, harsher winters. Winters became more intense and prolonged. The fjords, your vital lifelines to marine resources and the outside world, would freeze solid for longer periods, sometimes even year-round in certain areas, trapping your ships and cutting off access to seal and fish hunting grounds. This severely limited your food sources, leading to periods of acute starvation. The deeper cold also meant more fuel was needed for your longhouses, further straining your limited resources. Driftwood, peat, turf, increased sea ice. The North Atlantic, your only link to Europe, became choked with more frequent and extensive sea ice. This made voyages to and from Norway and Iceland incredibly perilous, increasingly difficult, and eventually almost impossible. Supply ships, once a source of vital iron, timber, and news, became rarer and rarer, leaving your isolated communities utterly cut off and desperately lacking essential goods. Imagine staring at the horizon for years, hoping for a ship that never came, knowing your lifeline was slowly freezing over. It really sucked to be slowly cut off from the world. Glacial advance. The immense glaciers covering much of Greenland began to advance, slowly encroaching upon the precious, limited arable land in the fjords, literally pushing your settlements towards the sea and reducing the already scarce pasture land for your livestock. This irreversible natural force chipped away at the very ground beneath your feet, gradually squeezing your communities into smaller, less viable spaces. The consequences of this climate change were dire and cumulative, leading to a profound deterioration of living conditions over generations. Your traditional Norse way of life, based on European-style farming and external trade, became increasingly unsustainable. The growing difficulty of farming meant less food, weaker livestock, and greater reliance on unpredictable hunting. The thinning trade links meant a severe shortage of essential iron for tools, forcing you to rely on scarce local iron, bog iron, or, even more dangerously, trade with the Inuit as discussed in Chapter 6, or scavenge from shipwrecks. The mortality rate would increase as malnutrition, cold, and disease exacerbated by a weakened population claimed more lives. Children would be born into increasingly difficult circumstances, facing shorter lifespans and a future defined by relentless struggle. The community, once vibrant, would slowly shrink, its resilience tested to breaking point by the relentless environmental assault. One common misconception is that the Norse vanished from Greenland overnight or due to a single catastrophic event. In reality, their disappearance was a slow, agonizing process of attrition over several centuries, driven primarily by this complex interplay of worsening climate, the Little Ice Age, their diminishing links with Europe, and perhaps increased tensions or competition with the increasingly well-adapted Thule Inuit. The Norse didn't fail to adapt in a simple sense, but their adaptations were ultimately insufficient against an overwhelming long-term environmental shift combined with a loss of their crucial external connections. Historians still meticulously study paleoclimate data from ice cores and sediment samples, archaeological evidence like bone isotope analysis showing dietary shifts, and changes in farm structures, and medieval texts like papal correspondence about a forgotten Greenland to understand the precise causes and multifaceted nature of the Norse disappearance, confirming it as one of history's most compelling cases of human societies struggling against long-term climate change. Furthermore, the psychological toll of living in a world that was visibly, irrevocably worsening would be immense. You would witness the growing ice, the shrinking harvests, the increasing scarcity, and the diminishing number of ships from home. This constant, pervasive sense of decline, this slow realization that your community was facing an existential threat from nature itself would erode your spirit, leading to profound despair, melancholy, and a feeling of being utterly abandoned by the very climate that once allowed your ancestors to settle. Your life became a testament to a losing battle against nature's indifference. The sheer powerlessness of the situation was terrifying. You could not stop the ice from advancing, prevent the temperatures from dropping, or force the sea lanes to remain open. Your fate was being sealed by global climate forces far beyond any human control, reducing your immense resilience and ingenuity to a desperate, ultimately futile struggle for survival. Your life was consumed by a relentless, uphill battle against an unstoppable enemy. The impact on your identity would be profound. You were Norse, a people of the sea and the land, but the sea was increasingly choked with ice, and the land was freezing solid. Your very way of life, your cultural practices like raising cattle, and your economic ties were being systematically undermined by the changing environment, forcing adaptations that transformed your identity, often painfully. So your life as a Viking settler in Greenland was profoundly sucked due to the devastating, irreversible assault of the Little Ice Age, the relentless cold, the advancing glaciers, the shorter growing seasons, and the increasing sea ice slowly choked the life out of your settlement, cutting off your lifelines and making every aspect of your survival a profound, agonizing battle against the very forces of nature. This pervasive climate shift was a defining, profoundly miserable aspect of your existence, ensuring that your long life in the Arctic was a continuous, losing fight for mere survival, even as your settlement battled the relentless cold and the insidious creep of the Little Ice Age. Your primary lifeline to the outside world, your very connection to your Norse identity, became increasingly tenuous. Forget regular communication or reliable trade. The immense dangers of the North Atlantic voyages meant perilous journeys and vanishing ships, slowly cutting you off, making your survival profoundly sucked. Imagine the immense anxiety that would grip your community with the approach of summer. When the sea ice finally broke up, your hopes would be pinned on the horizon, constantly scanning for the sight of a nar, a type of Norse merchant vessel, the sturdy cargo ship that was your only link to Norway, Iceland, and the wider European world. These ships brought vital supplies that Greenland could not produce: iron for tools and weapons, timber for building and repairs, and luxury goods that maintained your Norse identity and connection to European culture. But each voyage was a desperate gamble against the most formidable and unpredictable forces of nature. It truly sucked to watch your lifeline disappear over the horizon. The North Atlantic voyages were incredibly dangerous, even in the best of times. They stretched for thousands of miles across open, frigid water, taking weeks, sometimes months, to complete your ships. While seaworthy, were small and vulnerable compared to the vastness of the ocean. The dangers were manifold. Violent storms. The North Atlantic is notorious for its sudden, ferocious storms, capable of whipping up immense waves that could swamp or capsize your Nar in an instant. Imagine being tossed about like a toy, the wooden planks groaning, the sails shredding, as icy water crashed over your deck, knowing that if your ship broke apart, drowning in the frigid water was almost certain. Icebergs and sea ice. As the climate worsened with the Little Ice Age, the prevalence of immense icebergs calved from Greenland's glaciers and vast expanses of treacherous sea ice dramatically increased. These could crush a ship's hull, trap a vessel for weeks, or force long. Perilous detours that exhausted supplies. Imagine navigating a maze of colossal, silent ice mountains, always fearing a collision that would splinter your fragile wooden vessel. It really sucked to play dodgems with ice, fog, and low visibility. The cold waters often created dense fogs, reducing visibility to mere feet. This made navigation incredibly dangerous, increasing the risk of running aground, colliding with icebergs, or simply becoming hopelessly lost in the vast, featureless ocean. Limited navigation. Ancient Norse navigators relied on rudimentary tools like sunstones believed to help locate the sun on cloudy days and their knowledge of stars, currents, and bird migration patterns. These methods were effective for their time, but inherently less precise than modern navigation, increasing the risk of going off course and running out of supplies in the open ocean. Scarcity of supplies. Voyages required immense quantities of provisions, food, water, and fodder for any livestock carried. Running out of supplies mid-ocean meant starvation or forced rationing, further weakening the crew. As the centuries progressed and the Little Ice Age took hold, these journeys became increasingly difficult and less frequent. Ships from Norway and Iceland, faced with harsher conditions and dwindling profits from the Greenland trade as walrus ivory, a key export, became less fashionable in Europe, became rarer and rarer. What was once an annual lifeline became a sporadic hope, then eventually a distant memory. The number of vanishing ships, swallowed by the unforgiving North Atlantic, would undoubtedly increase. Cutting off your settlements piece by piece, it truly sucked to be slowly ghosted by your homeland. This decline in contact had devastating consequences for the Greenlandic Norse. Lack of essential iron. Greenland had very little native iron ore, and what existed, bog iron, was of poor quality and difficult to work. Your primary source of crucial iron tools, axes, knives, nails, plows, was imports from Europe. As ships ceased to arrive, your iron implements would wear out, break, and could not be replaced or properly repaired. This forced a return to more primitive tools: bone, stone, antler, crippling your ability to farm, hunt efficiently, or build. Loss of timber. Greenland also lacked large trees for construction timber, ship repair, or crucial firewood. European ships often brought timber as ballast. Its absence meant your longhouses might fall into disrepair. Your ships could not be properly maintained, and your ability to build new structures or coffins would be severely curtailed. Cultural erosion. The loss of contact meant a gradual severance from European cultural developments. Religious news, papal messages lamenting the lost Greenlanders highlight this. And the influx of new ideas or technologies, your community became increasingly isolated, clinging fiercely to traditions that were slowly becoming anachronistic, while the world moved on without you. The psychological toll of this increasing isolation was immense. You would live with a perpetual sense of anxiety, constantly scanning the horizon for a sail that rarely appeared. The knowledge that your only link to the wider world was tenuous and increasingly perilous, that your survival depended on ships that might vanish without a trace, would breed a profound sense of abandonment and hopelessness. You were literally watching your lifeline slowly freeze over and disappear. It really sucked to feel your world shrink and vanish. One common misconception is that the Norse in Greenland were completely cut off from Europe from the beginning. In reality, contact was regular for centuries. The decline was gradual, a slow process of abandonment rather than an abrupt severing. Papal letters and later European records show awareness of the Greenlandic settlements well into the 15th century. Though direct contact became extremely rare, the reasons for this decline are complex and debated by historians, involving not just climate change but also shifting European trade patterns. The demand for walrus ivory declined, political instability in Norway, and perhaps the Black Death. However, the result was the same profound, devastating isolation. Historians still meticulously study archaeological findings of imported European goods or their increasing absence in later periods of settlement. Detailed Norse sagas like the Saga of Eric the Red and Grenlandinga Saga, and later European shipping and diplomatic records to understand the precise patterns and eventual decline of transatlantic contact, confirming the profound and increasing isolation of the Greenlandic Norse. Furthermore, the very act of waiting for ships, year after year, for perhaps decades, would be a unique form of torment every summer. Your hopes would rise, only to be dashed by an empty horizon. This repeated cycle of anticipation and disappointment would wear down your spirit, leaving you with a pervasive sense of being forgotten, of being left behind by the very civilization you descended from. Your very existence became a testament to the brutal indifference of both nature and the distant world. The ultimate tragedy was that this isolation made any rescue or reinforcement impossible. As the little ice age tightened its grip, and as your resources dwindled, there was no one to turn to, no help coming from outside. Your fate was sealed by the very lack of connection, by the perilous journeys that eventually ceased, leaving your community to face its brutal end in agonizing solitude. So, your life as a Viking settler in Greenland was profoundly sucked due to the devastating reality of perilous journeys and vanishing ships, the immense dangers of the North Atlantic, coupled with the onset of the Little Ice Age, slowly choked off your vital lifelines to Europe, cutting off your access to essential supplies, new technologies, and cultural contact. This profound, increasing isolation, driven by the relentless forces of nature and the shifting priorities of your homeland, was a defining, profoundly miserable aspect of your existence. Ensuring your struggle for survival was a continuous battle against the chilling silence of abandonment. Even as your ships vanished and the cold tightened its grip, your ultimate fate as a Viking settler in Greenland was sealed by a terrifying, profound reality: abandonment. Forget rescue missions or easy retreats as conditions worsened. Help from Norway or Iceland simply stopped coming, leaving you to face your slow, agonizing extinction in utter isolation, making your survival profoundly sucked. Imagine the desperate hope that would fill your heart each year as spring thawed the fjords and summer light returned. You would scan the horizon relentlessly, day after day, week after week, for the sight of a ship from Europe. A gnar arriving meant vital supplies iron for tools and weapons, timber for building and repairs, as wood was desperately scarce in Greenland, new settlers, fresh news from the Norse homeland, and, crucially, a psychological link to the wider world. This ship was your lifeline, your connection to everything that defined you as Norse. It truly sucked to wait for a ship that never came. But as the Little Ice Age tightened its grip, as discussed in Chapter 7, these voyages became increasingly perilous and less frequent. The sea ice grew thicker and more extensive, making the North Atlantic crossing a terrifying gamble. The political landscape in Norway and Iceland shifted, with internal conflicts and new trade priorities diverting attention and resources away from the distant Greenlandic settlements. The market for Greenlandic exports, particularly walrus ivory, which was often traded for vital European goods, also declined as new sources like elephant ivory from Africa, traded via the Mediterranean, became available. All these factors conspired to make the Greenland trade less profitable and more dangerous, leading to a gradual severance of contact. The ships became rarer. A year might pass without one, then 2 years, then 5. The gaps between arrivals would stretch into agonizing decades, fostering a profound sense of being forgotten by your homeland. You would cling to the hope that a ship was merely delayed, caught in ice, or lost to a storm, refusing to believe that you had been actively abandoned. But the chilling truth would slowly settle, and the lifeline was gone. The wider Norse world had moved on, leaving you to face the increasingly harsh Arctic alone. It really sucked to be ghosted by an entire continent. This abandonment had devastating, cumulative consequences for your ability to survive. Loss of iron and technology. Without regular imports of iron, your vital tools, axes, knives, plows, nails for ship repairs would wear out, break, and could not be replaced. You would be forced to revert to more primitive technologies, relying on bone, stone, and antler for implements, severely crippling your ability to farm, hunt efficiently, or build and maintain your structures. This technological regression, imposed by isolation, significantly hampered your survival capabilities. Lack of timber, Greenland had almost no large trees. European ships often brought timber as ballast. Its absence meant your longhouses might fall into disrepair. Your ships could not be properly maintained, further isolating you, and your ability to build new structures or even coffins would be severely curtailed. This scarcity of wood was a constant, debilitating challenge. Cultural isolation. The cessation of contact meant a profound cultural isolation. You were cut off from new ideas, new technologies, new religious developments. The Pope himself eventually wrote about the forgotten Greenlandic diocese and the evolving sagas and news from your Norse kin. Your community became a cultural time capsule, clinging fiercely to traditions that were becoming increasingly irrelevant to your brutal reality, further deepening your sense of being left behind. No retreat, no rescue. As conditions worsened due to climate change, there was no longer any option for a mass retreat back to Europe. The dangerous sea lanes, coupled with the lack of ships willing to risk the voyage, meant you were trapped. If your community faced a devastating famine, a rampant epidemic, or increased conflict with the Inuit, as discussed in Chapter 6, there was no external aid, no rescue mission. You were entirely on your own, facing your slow demise in desperate solitude. The psychological toll of this abandonment was immense. You would live with a profound sense of despair, of being forsaken by your own people, the hope that once sustained your ancestors. The dream of a new life in a green land would slowly wither, replaced by the grim reality of a losing battle against an increasingly hostile environment. This pervasive feeling of being forgotten, of having your struggle go unacknowledged by the world you came from, would erode your spirit, leaving generations of Greenlandic Norse to suffer and slowly vanish in heartbreaking isolation. It truly sucked to be left to die alone. One common misconception is that the Norse settlers simply died out due to their own stubbornness in refusing to adapt. In reality, their disappearance was a complex process of attrition over several centuries, driven by a combination of factors, with the cessation of contact and subsequent abandonment by Europe being a crucial, often decisive, element alongside the worsening climate, the Little Ice Age, and potential conflicts with the Thule Inuit. While they did adapt significantly, e.g., increasing reliance on seals, the loss of vital European supplies, especially iron and timber, and the psychological impact of being cut off were ultimately insurmountable challenges that contributed to their demise. Historians still meticulously study shipwreck evidence or lack thereof in later periods. Detailed Norse sagas like the Saga of Eric the Red and Grenlandinga Saga, which increasingly mention difficult voyages, and papal correspondence lamenting the lost diocese of Greenland to understand the precise timing and reasons for the cessation of transatlantic contact, often finding a grim picture of gradual, unavoidable abandonment. Furthermore, the very act of waiting for the ships became a ritual of despair. Each year, as the ice broke, you would scan the horizon, your hopes rising, only to be crushed by the empty expanse of the ocean. This repeated cycle of anticipation and disappointment would wear down your spirit, making the silence of the sea a constant, mocking reminder of your increasing isolation. Your connection to the broader Norse world slowly became a ghost, haunting your remote settlements. The ultimate tragedy of the Norse in Greenland is that their final disappearance remains one of history's great unsolved mysteries. While theories abound, the lack of definitive records from their final years and the chilling silence that fell over their settlements serves as a poignant testament to their ultimate abandonment. Their struggle for survival, however brutal, ended not with a bang, but with a whimper, a slow, silent fading from the historical record, leaving behind only the haunting archaeological remains of their tenacious, yet ultimately doomed, settlements. So, your life as a Viking settler in Greenland was profoundly sucked due to the devastating reality of abandonment. As conditions worsened and the climate turned against you, help from your Norse homeland simply stopped coming, severing your vital lifelines to Europe. This profound, increasing isolation, fueled by vanishing ships and dwindling resources, was a defining, profoundly miserable aspect of your existence, ensuring that your long struggle for survival culminated in a slow, agonizing extinction in utter, heartbreaking solitude, forgotten by the world you once called home. You've endured the deceptive promise of Greenland, battled the relentless misery of the endless cold, subsisted on a monotonous diet of seal and dried fish, suffered under profound isolation, withered from rampant disease and decay, navigated complex and often fraught relations with your Inuit neighbors, felt the slow, crushing betrayal of the Little Ice Age, and desperately scanned the horizon for vanishing ships from home, only to confront the chilling reality of ultimate abandonment. As the phantom sounds of the icy wind fade and the imagined silence of your longhouse settles, a profound, lingering truth emerges. Being a Viking settler in Greenland was a slow, agonizing extinction, a haunting saga of survival against impossible odds that ultimately left your community vanished and unremembered by the wider world. Consider the fundamental environmental brutality that defined your existence. Your ancestors were lured by a deceptive name to a land that was, at its core, Arctic and unforgiving, the relentless cold, the pervasive permafrost, the short growing seasons, and the vast, impenetrable ice choked off your traditional farming methods and severely limited your food sources. The onset of the Little Ice Age, an irreversible climate shift, was the ultimate betrayer, transforming an already marginal environment into one utterly hostile to your way of life, turning your home into a perpetual freezer that slowly squeezed the life out of your settlement. It truly sucked to have your land literally betray you. Then there's the crushing weight of isolation and abandonment. You were cut off from your Norse homeland, separated by increasingly perilous North Atlantic voyages that eventually ceased entirely. This meant a complete lack of vital supplies like iron and timber, forcing a regression to more primitive technologies. Your cultural ties withered, and your connection to the wider European world faded into oblivion. The profound loneliness of being forgotten by the very civilization you descended from was a silent, psychological torment, leaving generations to face their grim fate in agonizing solitude. You were a remote outpost, ultimately deemed too difficult to maintain, and simply left to vanish. And what about the unrelenting struggle for mere subsistence? Your diet was monotonous and limited, heavily reliant on marine mammals like seals, lacking in diversity and essential vitamins, leading to debilitating diseases like scurvy. Every meal was a grim necessity, every hunt a dangerous gamble against the elements. Your body, perpetually undernourished and battling the cold, slowly decayed from chronic illness, suffering from rampant respiratory and gastrointestinal diseases. Your short lifespan was a grim testament to the cumulative toll of environmental hardship, dietary deprivation, and primitive medical care. Your existence was a continuous battle against forces that relentlessly sought to break you down. It truly sucked to always be one bad winter from oblivion. Finally, the haunting legacy of an unsolved disappearance. The Norse settlements in Greenland did not end with a single dramatic event. They faded slowly, agonizingly, over centuries, until the last few families simply vanished from the historical record, leaving behind only the archaeological remains of their tenacious struggle. Their story is one of a slow, incremental extinction, a poignant testament to the limits of human adaptation in the face of overwhelming environmental change and profound isolation. You were part of a community that simply evaporated, leaving behind a haunting silence, your personal suffering absorbed into the grand, perplexing mystery of your people's end. It truly sucked to be an unsolved historical mystery. The story of the Viking settlers in Greenland stands as one of history's most compelling and tragic case studies of human environmental interaction and resilience. They demonstrated incredible tenacity, adapting their building methods, their diets, and their hunting techniques to a challenging Arctic environment. They maintained their Norse identity for centuries, building churches and trading with Europe. However, their ultimate demise highlights that even the fiercest determination and the most ingenious adaptations can be insufficient against overwhelming long-term climate change and the irreversible loss of crucial external lifelines. Their tale serves as a chilling reminder of the fragility of human societies when pushed to the absolute margins of habitability. one particularly poignant and often overlooked. Detail is the last known written record from the Greenland Norse, a marriage entry from 1408. This single document, detailing a wedding, is the final historical trace left by the Western settlement, suggesting that life, however difficult, continued with its human rituals until very late. The chilling silence that follows this last entry, leaving centuries of unanswered questions about their ultimate fate, underscores the profound isolation and the slow, quiet nature of their disappearance. This final, mundane record, followed by an immense historical void, is a powerful and haunting testament to their eventual complete abandonment and vanishing. Historians still meticulously study radiocarbon dating of farm sites and human remains, ice core climate data, and the contents of middens waste heaps from both Norse and Thule Inuit sites to piece together the final centuries of Norse Greenlandic life, often debating the precise sequence of events leading to their ultimate demise and the exact role of environmental versus social factors. Ultimately, your life as a Viking settler in Greenland was a profound, horrifying battle against an unforgiving land and a changing climate. It was an existence defined by relentless cold, gnawing hunger, profound isolation, and a slow, agonizing decline. The promise of Greenland yielded a reality of ice, struggle, and eventual abandonment, ensuring that your long fight for survival culminated in a silent, tragic extinction, leaving behind a haunting, unsolved mystery in the vast, indifferent Arctic. As you now drift into a deep, comforting sleep, let the distant whispers of the Arctic wind and the imagined silence of Greenland's abandoned fjords finally subside. You are safe, warm, and secure, incredibly far removed from the brutal realities of a Viking settler's existence. May your dreams be peaceful, filled with the quiet certainty of comfort, warmth, and the profound resilience of human life in a world of abundance. A stark contrast to the horrifying truth we've explored tonight. And now, good night and have sweet dream. And